Hey everyone! So this is the third and final video in a mini-series that I've sort of done over the last couple of videos looking at the decision-making step of the policy cycle and some of the ethical frameworks that decision makers can use to make their decision. The first video looked at utilitarianism, which might be thought of as a centrist or liberal ethical framework. The last video looked at John Rawls' justice as fairness framework, which might be considered more of a left-wing ethical framework. And finally, in this video, I'm going to look at more of a conservative ethical framework. Now, of course, left, right is going to depend on which country you're in and what the politics of that country are. And no decision maker is going to follow any of these 100%. But again, it's useful for the policy formulation stage to know roughly what is important to your decision maker. So let's dive into this video on conservatism. The minimal state is the most extensive state that can be justified. Any state more extensive violates people's rights. This is from Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and succinctly summarizes his view on the role of government. His theory is often called the entitlement theory, and it is based upon three principles. The first is the principle of justice in acquisition, the principle of justice in transfer, and finally the principle of rectification. The principle of justice in acquisition addresses how individuals initially gain access to property. It states that individuals have the right to own something so long as they acquire it through just means. This typically means mixing your labor with unowned resources to create something new. In that case, you would have just ownership over it. You can also acquire something through just transfer, which we'll see in the next principle. Essentially, this first principle deals with how resources are acquired and whether or not that was done in a just way. The principle of justice in transfer deals with the transfer of ownership for a good from one individual to another individual. It asserts that the transfer is always just as long as it is voluntary and consensual. As long as there's no theft or fraud, the transfer is legitimate. However, he does not consider taxation voluntary and consensual even under a democratic government. He uses the example of thinking about a world where the distribution of goods is morally just according to whatever framework you follow. He then says, imagine a situation where many people decide to pay to go watch Wilt Chamberlain play basketball. They've now transferred some of their goods to Wilt Chamberlain. Now, to get back to a situation where it is distributed as per the original distribution, the government would have to take from Wilt and give to people who went to his game. He would consider that morally unjust because of the taxation of Wilt Chamberlain. And so he would argue that there's no morally just distribution of resources if it requires government intervention. Finally, the principle of rectification, which deals with situations where property has been acquired in an unjust manner. In other words, not through the principles of justice already discussed. It says that in a situation where someone has lost their property in an unjust manner, for instance through theft or coercion, they should be entitled to fair compensation. This is particularly interesting in the context of a video on conservatism because it clearly supports something like slavery reparations, which are not supported by modern day conservatives in the US. So that just again illustrates that it's important to not just understand, what theories broadly your decision maker supports, but some of the specifics about what they care about. Now, the most notable thing that a policy advisor advising a decision maker who purely follows Nozick's entitlement theory would have to note is that, of course, any taxation is morally wrong. Now, there are some critiques of Nozick, and they primarily concern the fact that his theory does not allow for government to address concerns around systemic inequality or social obligations. Now, Nozick is a libertarian flavor of conservative, but of course there are many different types of conservatives. A conservative philosopher that is a bit more moderate than Nozick is John Locke, who emphasizes property rights, but because he has a limited role for government, again, he's a bit more moderate, even if he's still conservative. Now, Locke is most famous for his theory on natural rights. That is, that there are some inherent rights that the government cannot interfere with, most notably life, liberty, and property. This is important because it influences his view on the role of government. He believes that there is a social contract between people and the government that states that the role of the government is to protect people's natural rights, again, notably their right over private property. Private property in Locke's theory is very similar to in Nozick's theory, where initial acquisition is through mixing your labor with some unowned resources, and then people are free to, use or dispose of their property as they see fit, so long as the use or disposal does not interfere with anyone else's natural rights. Again, because of this social contract, there is a consent given by the people to be governed by the government in this way. Now, it can be explicit or it can be implicit in people choosing to voluntarily live in that society. Because there's that consent component, there is at least some room for larger government than in Nozick's entitlement theory, although again, still quite limited. Now, in a situation where the government goes beyond what it is permitted to do in this social contract, the people have the right to rebel and revolt and replace the government with a new government which will properly follow this social contract. So Locke does provide some justification for government, which is why it's a bit more moderate than Nozick's entitlement theory, but it is still very limited. So a policy advisor who's advising a Lockean decision maker would note that government is acceptable to protect people's natural rights, but that the consent of the people does not go beyond that. So again, a slightly more moderate view than Nozick, but still a very conservative view on the role of government. Now, the most common criticisms of Locke's theory are very similar to the criticisms of Nozick's theory, but they also include challenges around consent to be governed in a modern context, and how it doesn't talk at all about the exploitation of shared resources for the collective good. A final type of conservative I wanted to discuss is represented by Edmund Burke, who doesn't so much focus on private property as he focuses on traditional social institutions. Now, I likely started my focus on the first two because, well, I'm an economist who loves to study taxation, but the validity of taxes isn't the only policy issue. Now, Burke focused a lot on the process of change, especially saying that any change should be gradual. He called this pragmatic conservatism. Now, he did acknowledge that change was necessary at times, but believed that any change should be gradual, cautious, and respectful of existing institutions. One of the reasons for this is his support of tradition and continuity, believing that existing institutions embody collective wisdom accumulated over many years. And so therefore it's unwise to abruptly change these institutions. Now, he also believed that it would be unwise to make changes based on abstract thinking or abstract theories, and instead believed that any policy changes should be based on actual experience. So again, thinking for a policy advisor, what would this mean? It would mean building on existing institutions rather than building completely new institutions. It would mean being respectful of historical precedents and traditions. It would mean focusing on incremental rather than drastic change. And finally, it would mean avoiding oversimplification and abstract thinking in policy design. Now, one of the major criticisms of the Burke theory is that it can be resistant to necessary change in the event of unjust systems, and that it can fail to address urgent issues. So as you can see, there's a variety of different philosophers that have contributed to conservative thought. And so as a policy advisor, it's not just sufficient to say, hey, my decision maker is conservative. It's important to drill down to better understand what type of conservative they are and which philosophers do they take their ethical framework from. So that's it for this 3-video series on the decision-making step of the policy cycle. Now, none of these videos were to promote or oppose any of these theories, because again, as a policy advisor, it doesn't matter which theory you support, it only matters what theory the decision maker ultimately supports. And so, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.